dungeons.
Now that I have your attention, let's begin. I am Swack, and the new Zelda game's dungeons exceeded my expectations and validated the naive glint in my eye that constantly reiterates the notion in regards to Nintendo. They're not so bad. Maybe they'll surprise me. I think I realized over my time apart from Nintendo that maybe I was the abusive girlfriend gaslighting the developers into thinking they were doing everything wrong, and her guy best friend, who definitely isn't anything more than that, is so much better than them, and she wishes there was someone out there like him that she could be with instead. We owe Nintendo an apology. Well, at least I do. I've been unreasonably harsh and sarcastic in my rhetoric toward them, admittedly, and it all came from a place of bitterness and resentment after Tears of the Kingdom. These developers are still incredibly talented. Aonuma is still incredibly talented, and I was making broad judgments about those working on the series without valid info, because obviously they still know how to make great games. Echoes of Wisdom is a step in the right direction for me personally. I don't believe I disliked a single dungeon, and while they're not all standouts, they all had something unique to bring to the table, and I just kinda had a blast. Forgive my saying this, but Zelda, in a legacy sense,
is back, baby, with new ideas and innovations to boot.
My reviews of these dungeons, which will be released weekly or bi-weekly, will be formatted as such. They will consist of 3 segments: lead up, atmosphere, and mechanics. Each dungeon in Echoes has a pretty lengthy regional side quest attached to it. They're functionally preludes to the dungeons themselves, so I feel like they're worth commenting on. Okay, let's go, let's freaking do it, let's go! Suthorn Ruins, funny haha pun ja 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 sussy Among Us joke funny humor with a chicken biscuit no honey mustard on the side is where we must begin, and man, I know I'm the guy who literally advocates for mediocrity being fun, but I feel a little too called out because Suthorn Ruins is adequacy incarnate, and yet I still love it. My rating for Suthorn Ruins was a 5 out of 10 on my original playthrough, and I still stand by that. Suthorn Ruins has the least explicit lead-up of all the dungeons, most of it consisting of interacting with the open world for the first time. Entering caves, gathering new echoes, it's all very tutorialized, which is why I lack much to say about it. I did find it relatively interesting that they kept the game so linear up until you beat Suthorn Ruins, though. You have to do this dungeon before your options open up, similar to the first dungeon in A Link Between Worlds, and I'm honestly not too upset or too jazzed about that, as some pretty necessary abilities are gained in Suthorn Ruins, so I suppose it does make sense. The only real thing I have to say about Suthorn's lead-up is that it foreshadows Link pretty well. Your meeting with the townspeople of Suthorn Village is pretty wholesome and functions as an enjoyable flavor text foreshadowing your meeting with him in the dungeon itself. Upon first entering the dungeon, you'll discover that it is the same domain you began the game in while first playing as Link. I find this unique, and I appreciate it as a mix-up from the usual formula. Literally starting the game in the first dungeon and needing to return to it is, I believe, something a Zelda game has never done before, so I like it. Aesthetically, I'll be honest, Suthorn Ruins is not jaw-dropping. It's not unenjoyable to look at, but it does reek of first dungeon aesthetic in all the ways that you'd expect. Primarily brown color palette, basic rune designs on the wall and floor, you get the gist. It's like a slightly more realized and aesthetically pleasing Tail Cave from the Link's Awakening remake, a dungeon that, in my mind, lost its original Game Boy charm visually when being translated into a 2.5D format. I do find the dungeon cute, though. Dark Nuts roam the halls, which is a welcome subversion of usual Zelda tropes, as these armored foes are typically reserved for the later game, and the overall idea of the dungeon being an abandoned temple lost to time residing right out of Link's home village is charming enough. Now, to anyone who's played the game already, it is no secret that Suthorn Ruins is incredibly easy. It is, after all, the first fully new traditional 2D dungeon we've gotten in 11 years, so it's understandable that Nintendo would want to make it as accessible as possible to new fans who may be unfamiliar with the old Zelda formula. Suthorn Ruins makes use of Bind as its main mechanic, an ability introduced directly before entering the dungeon. I love Bind. It feels like a more refined, limited version of Ultra Hand, being granted a level of consistency and focus through a positive limiting of possibilities. And it feels really good to use. I don't really need to explain why moving a giant rock with a tiny wand is awesome, it just is. They utilize this mechanic for a series of behind bars puzzles in which you have to move something that is out of your reach onto a button in order to progress. progress. Sorry. And they're simple enough, nothing to really complain about here. I understand why they're not very challenging. I do, however, appreciate how verticality plays a significant role in many bind puzzles, such as needing to align yourself properly with a slope in order to place a statue in just the right spot to solve the puzzle. Side note, the dungeon rewards being rupees is actually something I do not have an issue with at all, and you can check this video out to hear why. On the other hand, I will admit, as a bind lover, the follow mechanic is a bit clunky. While being able to follow the course of a moving object is fun while it works, it's pretty annoying when it doesn't. Positioning yourself in the right way when attempting to glide across a gap in tandem with a platform can be so hard to line up, and deeply dissatisfying when you just barely don't make it for the 18th time. However, granted, this may absolutely be a skill issue. I do really appreciate being able to use follow on enemies though. It took me far too long to realize this, but when I did, it was a pretty cool discovery. Another element Suthorn Ruins introduces is the return of Game Boy-style 2D sections, functioning as a bridge between rooms. These platforming segments have reached a pretty high level of quality compared to their predecessors. No longer are they a simple platforming segment with a couple of puzzles. They're full dungeon rooms with, oftentimes, even more puzzles than many of the top-down rooms. This greater focus on side-scrolling segments can provide for a vertical emphasis in puzzle solving, such as making use of the strandulas, or using the aforementioned bind ability on moving objects to mind a gap. And the side-scroller sections would be made even more dynamic and creative in later dungeons as well. Something that fellow Zelda tuber CaptBurgerson mentioned in the podcast linked in the description, go watch it, I'm in it, and it's super cool. Everyone's super cool and nice, they're wonderful. Is that the dungeon map does leave something to be desired, not retaining the maneuverability it perhaps needed in order to be able to process easier visually. The lines connecting each room to one another via the 2D sections are admittedly not very aesthetically pleasing to me, and as explicitly mentioned by Burgerson, the inability to zoom out further when managing the dungeon map is not preferable. Regardless, I think we're a little overdue in discussing the main attraction in Suthorn Ruins, at least to me. The Sword of Might and the Link mini-boss. Okay, obviously, this is just super sick, no buts about it. Fighting Link is super fun, and this battle differentiates itself from other Dark Link encounters by, well, not having you play as Link. Zelda has a different moveset, so it can be pretty thrilling and tense to watch Link mow down the barrage of enemies you're casting at him, and barely flinch when you bludgeon him with, I don't know, a freaking boulder. It really captures how powerful Link is in universe, and his second phase ushering in the subtextual revival of Purple Link is welcomed with open arms. It's a pretty gutsy move making the first mini-boss of the game literally Link, and I think it starts the dungeons off on the right foot as it's a properly paced and exciting moment. And of course, upon defeating the imposter among us, you get the Sword of Might, a limited use ability which basically turns Zelda into Link. I was originally a bit skeptical of this. I figured it would only compound the already overwhelming arsenal provided through your echoes, but after having beaten the game, I actually think it's an awesome addition. I don't really mind that it's basically just shoehorning Link into the gameplay, as you know, it's fun, and limiting it by introducing a timer makes the mechanic feel appropriately secondary. Echoes has fun sword combat, but it doesn't entirely replace your Echo combat, and luckily, you don't even have to choose to use it. So if you prefer Echo combat, you can just ignore the sword fighter form altogether, save for a few puzzles. I appreciate this feature overall, and while I do think it may have been overused just a little by myself in my first playthrough, I only used it so much because it was fun, so on a fundamental level, it's a positive for me. Before we take on the boss, I really only have one more aspect of Suthorn Ruins to touch on: the warp points. Faron's Wind is a permanent, developer-appointed fixture of each and every Echoes of Wisdom dungeon, and I'ma be honest, I like it a lot. Now, I do understand that it can trivialize backtracking, an element of dungeon traversal many people appreciate greatly. However, for me, this simply felt like an extra boost in efficiency, leading to the dopamine of solving puzzle after puzzle and optimizing my completion of the dungeon being heightened. Finding a key for a locked door you saw way earlier in the dungeon and being able to warp there instantly is very satisfying to me, and I don't really see a reason to dislike it other than wanting to spend more time on foot in any given dungeon, which is understandable. Regardless, it's time for the kingpin of Suthorn Ruins, Seismic Talus. He's great. I mean, he's just awesome. There's nothing else to say. He's just really stinking cool. Reintroducing a wild era enemy by creating a unique variant of it and turning it into a boss is a charming move from Nintendo, and it further contributes to the dungeon's thematic coherency. The basic premise is simple. Use Bind to pull his funny bone out and smack it till it explodes. What I'm referring to is his funny bone will make its way across his entire body, from his feet to his arms to his head, and your goal is to rip it out of his body while he's recovering from having issued a strong attack. He's just a good time. His hand slam attack and spin attack are both enjoyable to dodge, and he's generally just an excellent boss visually, and while he may not be anything incredible, he's above average in my eyes and pretty fun to fight. All of these elements come together to create a dungeon that, while not perfect, is a perfectly adequate introduction to the game, and the fact that Suthorn Ruins is my least favorite dungeon, whilst my opinion still remains generally positive towards it, speaks volumes. While housing some simplistic and unengaging puzzles along with a bit of clunk, Suthorn Ruins is a good first dungeon that I'd have no qualms with replaying over and over again whenever I start up a new playthrough. Oh yeah, and subscribe if you want to stay tuned for my next Echoes dungeon review. That dungeon being Suthorn Ruins. Oh, and check out my Patreon if you want. It's where I do Let's Plays, update videos, and I release videos there the second they're done rendering. So if you don't want to be at the behest of the almighty upload schedule, then check that out. All tiers get the same rewards. Yeah. Have a good day. I love you. Not personally, that's kind of weird, but in a nebulous sense I do.